How are we doing today, folks? So, last couple of days, really exciting couple of days. Yesterday was National Cheeseburger Day. Did anybody have a cheeseburger to celebrate National? I heard McDonald's was doing like 50-cent cheeseburgers. I'm a cheeseburger snob. I went to my favorite restaurant, had a cheeseburger there. But if you really wanted a good amount of cheeseburgers, you could have filled up on 50-cent cheeseburgers at McDonald's. I remember back when they did National Cheeseburger Day, back when I was still young enough to really enjoy McDonald's, back when I was like 17, 18 years old, because I worked for McDonald's right in my teens, and there were quarter cheeseburger days. So that was something. I guess inflation has kind of taken over, but yeah, it is what it is. But today, does everybody know what today is? Yes, today is International Talk Like a Pirate Day. International Talk Like a Pirate Day. So to basically to celebrate, I prepared for you all some AIS to pirate translations. All right, so just a little bit of background on this. When I worked at KPMG long time ago, it's like we're going on 20 years in that now when I started KPMG, but I learned about International Talk Like a Pirate Day, and I prepared accounting to pirate translations for my department and send them all out. And so here's an example of one. My boss, her name was Charlotte, a young lady named Charlotte. She was a very, very nice human being, except occasionally she would get a little bit grumpy. Usually it was grumpy because of something I did. But if it was any other day of the year, I would say, be careful. Charlotte is not in a good mood. But if it's International Talk Like a Pirate Day, then it'll be the sea, she be angry today. Yeah. So how do we actually translate some of this information into AIS? So let's go ahead and do some AIS statements, okay? Some things that we would talk about in this course. So we start out, IT governance is a critical component of organizational infrastructure. That sounds very technical and proper, right? All right, if a pirate were to say that, it'd say, "Arr, we be needing a sturdy keel, else we will be lost to chaos and mutiny." All right, it's gonna everybody agree with that, and we've got a good translation. All right, IT access controls are primarily preventive in nature. All right, so yeah, it's good to note. So pirate speak, sturdy locks on your treasure chest be stopping scallywags from plundering. By the way, this is all being recorded. So yeah, all right. Cybersecurity is a growing concern on the modern business landscape. All right, so the translation for pirate speak is the Kraken rises from the depths, threatening the calm seas of trade. And then we have, despite their potential, cryptocurrencies still have challenges as a means of exchange. Pirates would say, this booty be of dubious value. All right, and then something that's a little bit closer to home, something you all might be relevant. I feel that Dr. Barnes was a bit unfair in his grading. All right. So how would you say that in pirate speak? The captain be a bilge rat. All right. So yeah, now you know if you ever need to have those translations, okay? And so good to have that information just because you do need to kind of be able to be prepared for this day. It's September 19th every year. Unfortunately, next year it's going to be on a Saturday, so you won't actually be able to take advantage of that in your business courses. Okay, today we're doing some Excel stuff. So a little bit of background on this. The Excel stuff we're going to be doing today is going to be pretty simple and straightforward. It will set the stage for some of the things we will be doing later in the semester. One thing that about Excel that's fascinating is that for a very long time, Excel was kind of the visualization tool of choice. It was the only visualization tool available, so really that was all that we had to choose from. I was telling my graduate students a little bit earlier, we were doing some macros, and we're not going to get into macros in this course, but macros are kind of advanced Excel techniques that we would take a data set from another data analysis tool, and then we would download it in a format that Excel could read and open it in Excel and then run a macro to create all these graphs and charts of it. And that was kind of to set the stage for what we were going to be doing for that activity. So visualization is not extremely powerful in Excel anymore. We have tools like Power BI, which we're going to be using a little bit later in the semester, and Tableau that can do a much better job and a lot more interactive. That being said, the things that you can do in Excel are still pretty impressive. I think that it gets a bad rap simply because it's so commonplace now that most people can do it, that everybody's just kind of like, well, this is not all that interesting, all that engaging. There are a few things that we can note that are very simple, but they provide very good visual detail. And if we get a little bit further, we take a few more steps, we can provide some interactive detail, which is ultimately what we're shooting for. So let's go ahead and start out easy, and then we'll get to the complex stuff a little bit later. By complex, it's not particularly difficult. It's just a few additional steps. So we have our instructors here and instructor ratings for the month of August. And as we can kind of see here, Dr. Barnes rating solid at just below average with a 4. Uh, Professor Greiner, has anybody interacted with Professor Greiner at all? He is like one of the nicest human beings I've ever met. He's very excited about everything, okay? Me, I'm just kind of like, okay, it's a Wednesday. I have no excitement whatsoever. He is just always really enthusiastic, no matter what day of the week it is. So I wish I could be young and excited like him again. I think I may be one as was in my life. And then we have Dr. Caden starting out really high rating, doing really, really well. And everybody's doing pretty reasonable, very consistent. But Professor Greiner, unknown quantity. So everybody's kind of like really just ragging on him early on. So let's just say that we wanted to create a graph to show the representative breakdown. And we'll talk about what type of tables we would use for something like this. But we're going to create a simple bar chart. So let's highlight B1 through C2. We don't need to actually highlight the month because it's all the same month. And we're just going to insert, and we're just going to do a column or bar chart here. And let's just stick with 2 dimensions because that's pretty straightforward. And the thing is that this is so simple to do that everybody says this is not really that impressive. But if you put this into a display, it's a lot more powerful. I've actually been working on a presentation and some details on this for this particular course that talks about the nature of visualizations. And most people think in visual terms. So you can look at this data, you can look at this detail and get some value from it. But if you put it into a chart, it provides a lot more context. It's like saying, all right, well, it's obvious Dr. Deers and Dr. Caden are well loved, and Dr. Barnes and Professor Greiner have some work to do. Now, that's good enough, but oftentimes we want to have comparative analysis for data. We want to be able to look at a long series of terms. What if we have more data that's disaggregated? Let's go to the next tab, instructor rankings. So instead of having just 1 month, we got 4 months of data. And even just with only 6 observations for each month, this is really hard to make in comparative analysis. So there's a few ways we can approach this that can provide value. The first one's not really a visualization tool, but if I left it out, Dr. Caden would come for my hide, okay? And that the reason I say that is because it's pivot tables. Has anybody ever interacted with Dr. Caden in pivot tables? She freaking loves pivot tables. I sincerely believe that when her family starts talking about what it is they want to do for the weekend, she just pops out Excel and puts all the alternatives into a pivot table, and there derives value from that. She thinks pivot tables are the end all be all. I don't actually use pivot tables that much, occasionally, but not very often. I will say they have some value, but we're going to talk about what my preference is here in just a second. So let's highlight A1 through the end of the result, C25. And we're just going to do a very basic pivot table. We're just going to go over here, we're going to click on insert, and you will notice that we can just enter a pivot table. There's multiple ways to do this, but this is probably the easiest one if we already know our array. So we got our table range specified already. You can actually insert the pivot table and specify the array later, which is fine. It doesn't really matter. Let's go ahead and put this in an existing worksheet so it's self-contained, and we'll just start it at cell D1. We'll click on OK. Now, here's the problem with the pivot table is that we do have to specify what it is that we want to aggregate. When we did the chart, it was a limited number of parameters. We need to specify how the parameters are going to look. So let's go ahead and let's drag month to the columns. Let's do instructors in the rows and rating and values. We also are going to make one small change because the sum of the rating is really not relevant. The rating is a numeric value, but it's not a quantitative value. It's not something that we're going to do mathematical analysis for. So instead, or at least not summing the value. So let's go ahead and go to the values field settings and say an average value because that gives us more relevant information. And now we can actually get some meaningful detail from the 4 different series of observations. So interestingly enough, Professor Greiner started out slow, but in the semester came on strong. Okay, everybody's just kind of like, oh well, he's pretty solid. He's doing a good job. He's putting a good effort, and he's getting stronger as the semester goes on. Dr. Barnes just pretty consistently stays at 3.5. Says accomplished underperformer, an accomplished underperformer. Dr. Caden is the most interesting because you start out and you're just like, oh, she's wonderful. She's the most wonderful human being I've ever met. And then you take her first exam and says, I rescind my previous comments. The good news is she's pretty much teaching exclusively graduate courses now, so you don't have to worry about her attacks. But yeah, she definitely will test you. I kid. I obviously just tease about Dr. Caden, but she is a very rigorous instructor. If you've ever taken one of Dr. Caden's course, courses, you can actually appreciate that. But she is also a wonderful human being. I would say all of these are wonderful human beings, with maybe the exception of Dr. Eisen. Okay, and you can tell him I said that. You can tell him I said he's not a wonderful human being. And I've actually been trying to figure out if I can get a rise out of Dr. Eisen anyway. If I said something like that to his face, he'd just be kind of like, okay, man, I'm okay with that. That's fine. Reading Dr. Eisen, I tell you what. Let's go ahead and make a copy of this tab right here. So right click, and we're going to move our copy. We're going to make a copy and move it to the end. We're going to use one of my favorite tools in Excel. So I'm going to delete this pivot table. It's okay, we're going to replicate it here in just a second. But instead of creating a pivot table, let's do something like a pivot chart. So one thing that's really nice about visualization tools that we have is they are adaptive to different inputs. Something with Excel is that we have to manually adapt the inputs. Now, if we go back to the accounting or August 2025 rankings, we can change these inputs, but in order to do so, we actually have to delete existing data. So I can eliminate Michael Barnes in the graph, but I would have to delete the origin data. What I'd like to be able to do is have a tool that can do that for us without deleting the data itself. So let's do the same thing, A1 through C25. And we're going to insert this time. We're going to go all the way over to the middle of the insert tab and click on pivot chart. It's already got our range. We're going to use the existing worksheet, start it in D1, click OK. So range should already be selected. Existing worksheet, we're going to start it here. It's going to create our graph for us. It is in insert. And then, so I'm going to click on insert. Hold on, let me back up because it's not showing it right here. Okay, oops. So once we've selected our range, go to insert, and then it's right around the middle. It's going to be in the charts. It may not show up if it's not expanded out on your graph, but it's in the charts. Oops, destination reference. There we go.
Looks like online Excel does not have to.
Yeah, Excel online is problematic. So if you're working in Excel online, take diligent notes. That's my best advice for you. Yeah. All right. So same thing as before. Let's go ahead and drag month down to legend, structure down to axis, because this is going to be our rows and columns, and then rating to value. And we're going to change the rating again to average rating, although it doesn't really matter because we're just going to be, we're not aggregating information. And this is kind of nice, okay? Not just because it presents a graph with all the aggregated information, but because we can filter through this information. So let's say, for example, that we wanted to kind of just look at a particular month in time. I want to say, I want to look at the month of September instead of all months. We can go to the filter and we can just filter to September. And it'll give us a performance for that month. Dr. Barnes string is solid at a 3. What about if we wanted to look at an individual instructor? That's all we want to display. So let's look at Dr. Otero. Tell you what, I want to be Dr. Otero. Start out strong and just get stronger. Yeah, that's where I want to be. We can actually present comparative information. So we can present August, the beginning of the month and the end of the month, or in the beginning of semester, end of semester. So August and November. Kind of see massive deltas for Professor Greiner and Dr. Caden. Or we could compare instructors. Let's go ahead and say, look at Professor Greiner, Dr. Caden. Well, that tells a story right there, doesn't it? One going up, one going down. All right. Just to be fair, let's do Dr. Barnes and Dr. Caden. For all the grief I give Dr. Caden, she still outperforms me pretty handily. That's actually true about life. Anything I can do, she can do better, okay? Anything I can do. I honestly think that's true for auditing. She says that she doesn't know anything about auditing. I think she could come in and teach my class much more effectively. She just chooses not to, all right? She's like a superhuman being. But yeah, I do think that this has value in the processing. Again, Excel is not going to provide us nearly as many options as we can see in a true data visualization tool. But it does give us an insight of what we can accomplish with just a minimal amount of tasks. And this is still pretty impressive. I think if you did this to somebody who's not familiar with Excel tools, they would say that's kind of a cool feature of Excel. When we get to visualization tools, we're going to expand on this in a great way. So Power BI is going to give us a lot more options. We're just going to scratch the surface of this. And even so, we're still going to see some stuff that's pretty impressive. All right. With that, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about some AI today. All right. So as before, you may want to go to Copilot and log in. I think I'm going to log in just so I have, if I'm not already logged in. Not required that you log in, but it looks like I'm already logged in. Fantastic. Okay. So what we're going to be talking about today is based on an older book. It's late 2023. It's terrible that I have to say an older book from a year and a half ago. Okay, but this is, keep in mind, this is talking about the rate of change in AI. Literally, AI looks different a year and a half later from the time when this book was published. So some of the things that we're going to be talking about in this book may not be as relevant anymore. Now, the good news is the things we're going to be talking about are very broad adaptive rules, not necessarily rules that are going to be specific to AI tools that we're going to be using. But I do think this is an interesting book. This is by Ethan Mollick, who I've already quoted in this course. We're going to see the quote a little bit later. He is an entrepreneurship professor at the Wharton School, University of Pennsylvania. And very well known for his commentary on AI. He's one of the people in the forefront of business in AI. And I greatly respect some of his impressions here. I read this book, and whenever you hear me say read, if I mean it's something that I read in the past 5 years, it's that I put them on my AirPods and I listened to it while I was doing something else. And so this is an example of that. So I don't actually sit down and do much reading anymore, simply because I don't have the time or the capacity to do something like that. Anyway, he talks a lot about large language models in his book, which is one of the forms of generative AI and one of the ones that we're most prominent with. So for your AI analysis tasks that you're going to be doing, your research project, you're likely going to be using an LLM tool, which is kind of the front end of ChatGPT and Copilot, and provides some very, very unique and creative output. And so one thing that he says in his book, and he talks about large language models, is they're basically just sophisticated text predictors that are trained on massive amounts of data to determine appropriate responses. Basically, what they're doing is they're analyzing the text that you put in, and they're predicting what the next token should be. And a token is just a fancy term for a word or a part of a word. So has anybody ever played that game on their iPhone where you send a message and you type in something at the beginning, and then you hit the autocomplete and the prompt like the middle button? Okay, and it's like, so I did that. I texted Dr. Caden, and I started out with Stacy Caden is, and the autocomplete that I came up with is Stacy Caden is going through the process and now a part-time job in a company called and is working with a lot more people in the field, and I am not a big deal. It's incoherent babble right there. Which the funny part is I actually texted that to her afterwards. And then I had to explain, all right, I'm just exploring serious productive text for Wednesday's presentation. Yeah. So, this is a presentation that we were doing a few months ago. And so I was kind of interested in what this text predictor looked like. So obviously speaking, if you've ever used an LLM, it's not quite as bad as this, but it has a foundations in kind of bot chat in the same type of predictors. I think a more compelling example would be to think about my favorite thing is going to be food, and think about how we actually engage in recipes. So has anybody ever had chicken tikka masala? Okay, I'm a big fan of tikka masala. My brother made it a few years ago. My brother's an exquisite chef, and he made it a few years ago, and I just fell in love with it. And I've been tinkering with the recipe. And so here's kind of the ingredients that we have for the recipe with respect to tikka masala. And so this is kind of a recipe that I got from an outside source. My recipe is slightly different here, but I just listed them in alphabetical order. Now, if I just got rid of the quantities here, Would there be a problem? Could I just say, all right, you need basmati rice, butter, chicken breast, chili peppers, cilantro. If I just listed the ingredients and threw them at you, could you make tikka masala? No, there's a critical component missing in that not all the quantities are exactly the same. So the quantities are very, very important in any given recipe. The quantities are very important. And so that's something that we have to actually keep in mind when we think about the recipe is that it's that they do need to be around the same area. Now, once we have a path to that, we can put some variations in. So say, for example, you look up here and say, all right, looks like Dr. Barnes' recipe only has like a 1 teaspoon of sugar. That seems like a little bit, or has too much, tablespoon of sugar. Seems like a little too much. So I'm going to adjust this downward. And so we got 99.99 tablespoons of sugar. Now, let's say that I just make sure. So basically what's going on here is I'm using the rand function, which we talked a little bit about last week. And I have this by a multiplier of a certain range so that every time I enter new information, it just adapts a little bit. So it's effectively the same recipe, but you will notice that these small changes are going to make differences in the flavor of the ingredients, the combination ingredients. I'm not changing it enough to actually change the recipe in a meaningful way, but small subtle differences. I can also say that the different ways I prepare the ingredients, because there's a certain sequence in how you have to prepare that. Like you don't throw everything in a pan and toss it in the oven and say turkey dinner. That's not the way things work. You do have to prepare this a certain way, but changing the quantities of ingredients would actually change this. So in LLMs, if I put in a single prompt, am I always going to get the same response? No, we learned that from our last AI, or I think maybe our first. Well, sorry, from our first AI discussion, which was that last week. Time flies when you're having fun. Yeah. So remember we did the dad jokes, and we got different dad jokes when we put in the same prompt. The idea is similar here. Is that basically depending on the temperature, it's going to give us information that's going to have similar characteristics, but are going to be different in response. And that's a unique characteristic of LLMs is they provide ranges based on the temperature and the tokens that they are predicting. So let's go ahead and see if we can utilize that to our advantage. So something that Ethan Mollick said, and this is something we've already talked about in this course. We've had this exact same slide in the course, but I want to remind you about this. The thing about LLMs that makes them unintuitive and then analogizing them to sci-fi AI is less useful than thinking of them as infinite copies of some guy named Steve, a grad student who's great at coding and at art, but is widely read, but makes up stuff when he's pressed. We're going to talk a lot about the last part next week. We're going to talk about AI concerns. Part of that is going to be hallucinations, where AI just basically says, hey, this is something you should know. And it's like, this doesn't exist. This is not real. And you say that probably shouldn't happen. Yes, it's true. It shouldn't happen, but it does happen, which is one of our big concerns, AI. It's also one of the big reasons why we should be very, very confident that as long as we're well skilled in our areas, that we can provide value, because AI will not be perfect. And it's shown even over the past couple of years of development that it can't be perfect. So something we need to note about, but we're going to focus kind of on this idea of think this infinite copies of some guy named Steve. Now, what is Steve going to provide? Steve will provide consistent feedback given a topic, but it will not be identical feedback. Think about if I asked you a question, if I asked you a basic question that was open-ended, not a closed-ended question like what's 2 + 2? That's objective question. It's going to be 4 every single time. You're not going to vary in your responses. But I was saying, how are you feeling today? If I ask you today, you're going to give me one response. If I ask you a different one, you're not going to give me a verbatim response. At least if you did, that would be really, really weird. Okay. So the idea being is that Steve is going to give us a slightly different response every single time, very similar in context in all likelihood. It's very unlikely that I'm going to, if I ask you a question like, how are you doing today? You're going to be like, I'm doing great today, Dr. Barnes. Everything is perfect and everything is awesome. And then I come back to you the next day and just going to be kind of like, we're all doomed. All right. I'm going to say, what happened in between yesterday and today that changed your perspective? Because that's going to have to be an explanation. We're kind of looking at some consistency, but with some variation. So Mullick's got 4 rules of co-intelligence, and we're going to talk a little bit at length about each of these, but I do want to talk about a few of these in context with respect to how we're going to approach this for this particular discussion. So first of all, always invite AI to the table. Now, I do want to throw a caveat out here. I do think that for every task that you do, with certain exceptions, you can use AI here at Truman State, and it can be effective. Now, some of those exceptions are going to be physical activities, like you generally cannot become a better basketball player or a better baseball player or a better football player with AI. Now that putting that in context, it can actually help you develop your training routines and learn how to do things that would make you better in those activities. But you can't actually carry an AI bot with you and say, okay, should I turn left or turn right when you're trying to dodge a tackle? That would be weird. Okay. Maybe we're going to evolve it at some point, but inviting you to the table there would not be effective. Also, keep in mind that I'm not speaking for every other instructor. Some instructors may not want you to use AI for certain tasks. For example, here in a few weeks when we take our first exam, AI is going to be forbidden for that exam. And I know if you're saying, Dr. Barnes, if you're adopting AI, you should adopt it wholeheartedly. It's like, yeah, those exam scores would skyrocket with very little preparation, which maybe that's what we're looking for in the long term. But I do want you to have at least some culpability for the exam, some responsibility. Next, be the human in the loop. Okay, you are not the AI tool, so you do need to engage with the AI. So you need to understand what your role is. Also, something that's really important. I think this is probably number 3 is the most important one. Is treating AI like a person, but you're going to tell it what kind of person it is. We're going to have an example of that a little bit later. We're going to say, you AI, you're an expert in this field. Talk like an expert in this field. Now, some jokes can come from this, like the things where I talked about the pirate speak earlier on. I used Copilot to help me out that, and I said, Copilot, you're a pirate. How would you translate these phrases? And it was not. I didn't use exactly what Copilot said. I adapted a little bit, but I used some terminology to help me out with the translations. So that's an example of how we can use it in fun ways, but in meaningful ways. If you wanted to say, I'm a middle-aged accounting professor who teaches both AIS and auditing. How would I critique this particular essay? You can get an idea of how I would approach a critique if you were to submit something to me. So say, for example, I'm a middle-aged accounting professor who's telling the tool, you're a middle-aged accounting professor who teaches AIS and auditing, and you're very, very insistent that the student emails be formatted in a perfect manner. Critique my email, and then you can paste your email in there, and you can see the things that I would say if I got your email. By the way, I've received some emails that have been a hair away from critiquing. Yeah, it's like when somebody starts out with "Hey," I know that that's kind of a standard greeting, but yeah, that's remember we do the professional emails when we connect. Okay, I'm not giving you a hard time about that. I'm just saying that that's something that I would do if I was critiquing emails. So you can tell I have not been critiquing emails. The fourth one is kind of an interesting one. It assumes that this is the worst AI that you will ever use. So AI is constantly evolving. Remember earlier I said this is an old book because it's a year and a half old. Does anybody know what the capability increase of AI is? Like how its capabilities are doubling, like how frequently? 8 months. It's taking 8 months for AI capabilities to double. For context, modern technologies take about 2 years, which is still an insane rate. It's an obscene rate of increase. But basically, the AI tools that you were using a year and a half ago are completely and totally outdated. They are completely and totally. They've had 2 different iterations that have been improved. So some of the tools that I've used in the past are no longer even relevant anymore, which is good news because some of these problems that we're talking about with AI today and we're going to be talking about in the future, they may not be problems in the near future. They may not problems and issues in the future. Right. So here's our activity. So we're going to talk about prompt engineering. We're going to start out with talking about how we can write a prompt. So what I would like for you to do is I'd like you to enter the following instruction for Copilot. I want you to tell Copilot, tell me a good analogy for large language models. Tell me a good analogy for large language models. This is what you're entering into Copilot. If you've got the slides open, you can copy and paste, though I would copy and paste plain text only. All right. So that was a pretty easy task. Did anybody get supercharged autocomplete on steroids? Okay. Did anybody get like a super librarian or something like that? We got different answers, which is kind of interesting because we all had the same prompt. Now, this is interesting. So we actually asked the same prompt and we got different information. Are both those valid analogies? Is one analogy better than another? Probably one is more appropriate. Is there a way that we can actually use our AI tool to come up with what we think is a best analogy evaluation? So in the past, one of the things we could do is we could say, give us 10 analogies, and it would give us a list of analogies. And then we could painstakingly go through the pros and cons list. Has anybody ever done a SWOT analysis? Strength, weakness, opportunities. Don't those suck? Yeah. I mean, they can be very beneficial and very useful, but yeah, they take a lot of time and they tend to be problematic. What is a better way? What is a better mechanism for us to actually incorporate that? Could we have the AI tool do its own pro con analysis? That would be wonderful, wouldn't it? If we could eliminate all the busy work and say, hey, you're a lot faster, you're a lot think a lot more quickly than I do, so do your own busy analysis. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's go ahead and do that. Let's go to the next slide. So here's a prompt, and this is actually adapted from Ethan Mollick's book. I changed it a little bit. Think this through step by step. Come up with good analogies with let's go ahead. I think I should put a number in here. So let's go ahead and do 5 good analogies for large language models. First, list possible analogies. Secondly, critique the list, and then 3 more analogies. Next, create a table listing the pros and cons of each. Finally, pick the best one and explain it. I think I meant to put 10 in there, and then I forgot to put a number in there, but we'll do 5. All right, so the list of analogies you got was probably fairly consistent across the board. So I think we had supercharged autocomplete was one, giant librarian, and then language mirror, predictive text rock, and alien archaeologist. Probably fairly consistent, although it may have been some differences there. Then when it added 3 more, it added recipe generator without testing, statistical parrot, and language blender. Those were my list, and the pros and cons were listed out of those. And much to my surprise, it said the best analogy in its opinion was the recipe generator without testing. Now, I'm guessing somebody probably got something different for their result in there. Did anybody get like the genius librarian as their best result? You know why I'm surprised is because every single time I've ever run this previous to right to now, it said genius librarian or giant librarian with genius or something like that. Yeah, that was always the one it came up with, which is weird. It comes up with that. But I do like the analogy of the recipe generator without testing. It actually does give some analysis on why this is a good one. So there's different ways to approach this particular problem, and it comes up with something unique. If I were to tell you to just come up with analogies and you had to come up with 8 analogies on your own, how long would you work on this project? Like if you had no AI tool, would you just basically say, I could do this in like half a second? Probably not. This would probably be like, okay, this is not only a waste of my time, this is just busy work assigned by Dr. Barnes. I like something I was telling my one of my student classes that I loathe to do busy work without any real function. And while I think this is an interesting task, an interesting chore, coming up with analogies for 8 different ways to categorize LLMs, I think that would be truly busy work with no real function, especially now that we have an AI tool that can do that for us. So that's something you should think about, is if it's something that is just busy work for the sake of busy work, this is an area where you can leverage AI to be effective. Now, do we still need to be able to do the analysis on our own? Do we still need to be able to do the evaluation? How many people are just going to buy into the idea that recipe generator without tasting is going to be their best analogy? I'm a little bit cautious to say that's the best analogy. First of all, because I know every single other time I've run this query, which is probably about a half dozen now, it said genius librarian. Secondly, taster without recipe generator without tasting, that's kind of missing an important component. What does every chef do when they're creating their dish? Hopefully they're tasting it. Yeah, at least smelling it, at least coming up with some sort of olfactory senses that can actually tell you whether the recipe is good or not. I'm not really ready for AI to start cooking my cheeseburgers just yet. That's the problem. All right. So some important points about that. There was a difference in this particular statement and this particular statement. Where does this come up from? This is an important idea when we talk about how we approach large language models. The concept is called prompt engineering. Has anybody heard the term prompt engineering before? Heard that analogy? You're probably going to get very familiar with that in the coming years, particularly not just in this course, but in your jobs and in your life. Prompt engineering is going to be very, very critical, at least in the early years of AI. The idea behind prompt engineering is the designing inputs and prompts to guide AI models to produce the desired outputs. How many people have actually asked a question of AI and got something that they weren't looking for? I know I have. Remember earlier in the semester, we saw a picture of show me the credentials of Michael Barnes. So everybody remember that when we asked about Michael Barnes and we saw a very, very handsome individual that was not me at all? Yeah. You have to be very, very specific about what your prompts are. If you just ask it very general, basic questions, then it's kind of it's a gamble as to whether or not it's going to come up with the information. Now, like I said, we're getting better over time. The LLMs will become a lot more precise and a lot more effective in this regard. But we do need to provide context, instructions, and examples to help the AI understand what the intent, and to be able to respond in a meaningful way. Now, it's important to note that I actually came up with this definition not on my own, but I actually prompted Google Gemini to come up with it. And I would edit it a little bit, but for the most part, I was very impressed with the definition of prompt engineering. So what are some considerations with prompt engineering that we need to be aware of? Well, first of all, we want to treat the AI like a human, but tell it what kind of, or like a person, but tell it what kind of person it is. So tell the AI who it is. We also need to tell the AI who its audience is, because that's going to be important to note. Not only how do we communicate the information that's relevant, but what's the best way to communicate it? Can we say that the way I communicate in this class would be different than if I was communicating to a kindergarten class? I don't know. Some of you may say, Dr. Barnes, explain this to me like I'm 5 years old, like pull an old Michael Scott on me, you know? And sometimes that can be important and relevant. But for the most part, I assume when I use big words, everybody has the capacity to understand most of those big words. And if you don't understand the big word, you can Google it and say, what did Dr. Barnes mean by vociferous? Does anybody know what vociferous means, by the way? That's another task for an AI tool right there. Okay. Then provide specific instructions. When we need more detail, we can provide the better. Also, we may want to ask the AI for clarification or more detail on important points. So remember the second prompt that we looked at. That second prompt, it didn't just say, provide a list. It said, critique your list, and then add 3 more examples based on that. And interestingly enough, in my list, one of those 3 additional examples that came up was the best analogy that it came up with a conclusion. So even that additional detail can have some relevant value. We also want to make the AI present information in different ways. Looking at it from just one parameter framework, just a narrative sprawl, can be problematic. So we did a pro and con list and a table, and it looked at the information and categorized it differently. This can actually be very valuable for tools that the AI is not very good at. Has anybody ever asked the AI tool how many R's are in strawberry? More recent AI tools have become more effective in that regard, but keep in mind that LLMs are not calculation tools. So it doesn't actually count the number of R's in strawberries. It goes and looks up online and say, how many people say that the number of R's in strawberry? And a lot of times people have the misconception of thinking there's 2 R's because they see 2 R's right next to each other and ignore the first R that's in straw. That's why LLMs can be a little bit dangerous. If we present that in different terms, if we say, okay, look at each individual letter and count instances of R, it's probably going to provide us better output if we provide that level of detail. We can also use our own previous knowledge to improve subsequent AI output. Remember I said that you have to be the human in the loop? Your value is not going to be from your ability to use AI. Your value is going to be able to critique what the AI output is. Don't get me wrong, AI is becoming more powerful over time, and eventually it may have more expertise than anybody in this room. But as we're moving along, you do need to be able to look at information and come up with context. So easy way to look at this output and be able to use knowledge. Say, for example, you try to do a research paper. Say, I'm going to do a research paper for my tax class, and it cites Barnes 2026. Can we actually take into consideration that that probably is not a valid response? That's not a valid research prompt. There's a couple problems with that. First of all, we're not in 2026 yet, so it's going to be hard to cite something from that year. Secondly, citing anybody named Barnes on a tax paper is probably a bad idea, okay? Probably a bad idea. That person does not know anything about tax. So here's what I'd like for you to do, since we got like 7 minutes left. So use Copilot, or you can use a different LLM if you want to use ChatGPT. I want you to create and refine an analogy of a topic of your choice. And you should follow these examples in your prompt. You should start by reviewing LLM's knowledge of the topic area, provide detailed prompts to aid the LLM in topic development, and as necessary, revise and clarify your prompts to improve the LLM output. This should not take you a long time. This is probably only going to be 3 or 4 prompts, but see if you can come up with a clear, detailed analogy over something that's very technical. Like, say you're saying, I don't understand what Dr. Barnes meant by IT governance earlier on when he made his pirate jug. So can we provide an analogy for IT governance or something technical, a detailed analysis like that? See if you can develop a detailed prompt within the next 5 minutes. All right, I know we haven't had a lot of time and you're probably still working your prompts, which is fine. This is just more of a thought exercise than an actual assignment. I decided to do something a little bit fun. So we talked about The Office, and one of my favorite clips from The Office is explain this to me like I'm 5. Has anybody seen that episode? Yeah, so it's about the concept of budgeting, which I talked about when I used to teach 221 when I taught managerial accounting, because there was that budgeting topic. So I wanted to see what AI would come up with, and I said, here's an episode of The Office that Michael had a problem with the concept of budgeting. Can you explain it in a simple analogy? And they said budgeting is like having a box of box of juice boxes for the week. I don't like the terminology there. So you have 7 juice boxes at 7 days of the week. If you drink 1 juice box each day, you'll have enough for the whole week. But if you drink 3 juice boxes on Monday, you'll be run out for the week out. So budgeting means planning how many juice boxes you can have each day so you don't run out. Wouldn't it be simpler if we just taught accounting 221 like that? Wouldn't that be great? We could all learn it at 5 years old instead of having to wait until we're in college. Yeah. That may be a little bit too much to ask, because then we'd have to do variance analysis, and that I think is well beyond anybody has to do at 5. All right. With that, I'm going to call it a week. We will be back for chapter 8, I believe, on Monday. Have a good weekend. I'll see you all then.